The Marquis de Sade was an 18th century disgusting, sick, and twisted pervert, aka a Frenchman who, in 1795, famously or infamously penned a work titled Philosophy in the Boudoir, also translated as Philosophy in the Bedroom. The work is quite literally what it sounds like. It is written as a set of dialogues meant to instruct a young girl in the ways of perversity and being immoral and really just all manner of nasty and unforgivable. And a lot of the instruction involves lots of butt stuff. And I've noticed that it seems to be the Marquis de Sade's thing. He really just loves to emphasize butt stuff throughout his repertoire. I guess he was really into that. And thank you for joining me in this literary discussion, by the way. But yes, essentially what the Marquis de Sade is establishing in Philosophy in the Boudoir is the notion that perversity, that being immoral, that being on the opposite side of propriety, can actually lead to some kind of fulfillment in terms of human integrity, which is, I know, a wild and horrifying concept. So yeah, welcome to Plagued by Visions. So in order to understand the truly radical points that the Marquis de Sade is making here and where they're coming out of, one has to contextualize his work in terms of history. And of course, one has to remember that the Marquis de Sade is writing from a time of just extreme revolution. You know, of course, in terms of a political revolution, such as was the uprising against the French monarchy, which was still fresh in, the history of the making of society in the Marquis de Sade's eyes. But also one has to remember that it was during this time that, the entire concept of an age of reason, right, of an enlightenment was sort of bulldozing all other notions of what human integrity and human identity meant. It was during this century, it was during the Marquis de Sade's time that humanity sort of started to define itself, sort of moving away from the notion of religion, and moralizing our existence in that sense, and more in upholding the ideas that being morally and logically and intellectually just and upright are the correct ways to live life, right? And that's what everybody should aspire to. These are new notions. Of course, being a good person, I think, has always been an integral part of who we are, and being a bad person as well, as the Marquis de Sade alludes to. These are not new concepts, but what I'm trying to say is that during this time, these concepts became part of our human identity, and it was strictly tied to an intellectual and philosophical movement. And that is how we chose to define ourselves from there on. And of course, that idea spread globally thanks to colonialism, to where now there is this seemingly universal notion that it is the Western thought, the Western forms of logic and reasoning that champion above all else, right? But the Marquis de Sade is writing from a perspective of, well, have you considered that being a nasty-ass pervert is also humanistically and spiritually fulfilling? And of course, we love him for that. We stand. So it's this notion that one doesn't need religion. This is a staunchly atheist work. There are entire passages and dialogues that speak against, the notion of being religious. So it's very anarchist in that sense, right? And it also speaks against the idea that we have to be good people. He says all we have to be is, happy and pleasured people, and one can attain that in other ways. Remember, butt stuff and all that. The Marquis de Sade is speaking against the grain of the age of reason, and that's why he was billed as a madman and incarcerated, and also because he fed a bunch of botflies to underage girls because he told them that it was an aphrodisiac, and they actually became extremely ill. I don't remember if they actually passed away from that, but don't get me wrong, the Marquis de Sade was quite clearly a horrible, horrible person, but of course he never really denies that in his writing. And as much as we can revile the person, we also have to acknowledge that his writings speak from a perspective that is quite unique because, like I said, it's going against the grain of what human integrity is supposed to be, right? We get a glimpse of another side, right? Of another world, a world that we're not supposed to be in, but from which he writes from a philosophical perspective, saying there is phenomenological worth in all this, piss and shit. And that is extremely valuable because it provides us with a way to undo, that idea that human integrity is dependent on logic and reasoning and morality, right? Because the Marquis de Sade is saying there is another side to humanity and we can articulate it. We can draw fulfillment from it and we can philosophize it. We can turn it into a lifestyle. And that's pretty horrifying, but also, really destabilizes the notion that there's just one way that things should be, right? And one can acknowledge that without necessarily supporting all the horrible, gross stuff that he writes about here. But the one thing about the Marquis de Sade is that he's writing purely from a moralistic sense and is acknowledging a dichotomy between good and evil and is saying, well, I'm evil. But I don't care because it makes me feel good. But he does say, he does admit that there is that dichotomy, right? But there are later writers who still, write about perversity and how it fits into human identity. But that dichotomy begins to be destabilized over the centuries. And moving forward a little bit more than a century, that's where we arrive at the writings of Mr. Sigmund Freud. Now, everybody knows Sigmund Freud as that dude that says that everybody wants to fuck their mom or their dad, and that everybody wants to do all manner of horrible things to all of their orifices and so on and so forth. And that's why he's so loved by some, like myself, but also reviled by normal people, I guess, because indeed he was writing about medical cases, right? He was saying, no, this is, a biological reality here, but it has to do with an unconscious, right? And again, he is injecting logic and reasoning in spaces where one would expect them to not exist at all, like the Marquis de Sade, right? The Marquis de Sade is writing about eroticism and perversity, but from a perspective of, being a philosopher. And likewise, Sigmund Freud is writing about the unconscious, right? The unknown, the unfathomable workings of the human mind, but from the perspective of a medical doctor. But more than that, in here, he writes about perversity and how it's pretty much nascent in all of us. And, does he reach actual, medical conclusions? I say no, of course not. A lot of this, in the actual medical field of psychology and psychiatry is all nonsense and, rightfully so. And a lot of it is also extremely problematic, especially how Sigmund Freud writes about the psychologies of women and children and non-white races. Yeah, he was a European white dude, come on. But all the same, what I'm trying to get at is that he is acknowledging, the darkness, the obfuscated, the unfathomable, but trying to work with it, through metrics, through reasoning and thinking, and reaching conclusions that are not factual, but they're still fascinating, and they follow a kind of signifying chain in the human mind that does connect to something integral in all of us. And specifically, I wanted to address the case of little Hans. This is the case in which a little boy has a phobia of horses, and that phobia, manifests itself in all manner of really perturbing ways. But of course, Freud, being Freud, reaches the conclusion that this phobia of horses arises from the big penises that horses have, and how the child has a phobia of that because a whole manner of complex situations in his life that it just would take too long to explain have made it so that he's not able to harness his infantile libido, and so it is going haywire and sort of attaching itself to all manner of weird things like big horse cocks. I tell you, it is a fucking riot reading this guy. But yeah, he talks about Oedipus complex, castration anxiety, and how all of these things manifest in the child because it is a parent's duty to sort of form the child's libido so that it is proper and fits into, societal norms. And the concept that Freud extracts from that is what he calls polymorphous perversity. Here he's writing about perversity from that medical point of view and saying, well, perversity is actually something essential and is actually something necessary when it comes to the forming of our human identity and what we later go on to become when we become proper righteous adults. In his theory, children are polymorphously perverse because they have not yet been indoctrinated, essentially, into the ways of thinking about how sexuality works in society. And he's saying that, from birth, our libidos, because they're so infantile, right? Because they have nothing to attach to, because we're children and we have no sexual drive, they instead can attach themselves to all manner of things if proper instruction on how sexuality works is not given to the child from a young age, and if proper rearing is not present. So essentially he's saying that the cure for the polymorphous perversity is to swaddle a child's libido, to instruct them in the ways of sexual propriety so that they turn out to be good adults. So essentially the model that Freud is drawing here is that children's sexuality and libido and their polymorphous perversity is this kind of explosion of freaky sex things, right? That have no meaning, that have no form, that have no value, again, because they don't mean anything to a child who is not yet sexually mature. So it is the parents' job to swaddle, to tie all of that and to, plug all the holes so that all this polymorphous perversity stops coming out and we are left with the fully formed shape of a proper adult. But he's saying that if we don't make sure that we plug all those holes properly and tie up, the human child's libido properly, some things are going to come spilling out in adulthood. And those are what he calls, perversion, paraphilias, those kinds of things, neuroses, fetishes, so on and so forth, which is fascinating, very, very, very imaginative Freud, very, very good. But again, Freud here is hinting at something, doesn't outwardly say it per se, but it is it's something that writers like Georges Bataille, like Michel Foucault, like Judith Butler have sort of honed into and really just magnified this kind of a contradiction or almost unspoken truth about human essence that Freud is positing here. And essentially, if polymorphous perversity is taken to be a real thing, then Freud is actually kind of saying that that's the natural way of being, right? That's the natural human state. And all of this sexual propriety is artificial. It's man-made, that, the gender dichotomies, that the sexual identity of heteronormative and heterosexual is, artifice, that the polymorphous perversity has to be shaped into heterosexuality and heteronormativity. And so, writers from a feminist and queer perspective, being the bad bitches that they are, play around, very humoristically sometimes with the notion of, well, then doesn't that mean that we're all just naturally, crazy, really horny and really weird perverts? And that everything else, is a man-made folly? And from there, now we jump into Miss Foucault, who writes about perversity, follows this notion of sexuality that Freud presents, but then contextualizes it in terms of it being essential to forming culture, society, and the power structures within it. So what Foucault says on his essay, A Preface to Transgression, and transgression is of course a very familiar word around these parts, he is saying that in this definition of human sexuality that Freud, posits to the world, that he has truly, unmasked the mysticism behind sexuality and has splayed it in its sort of a medical reality, right? In its animal reality. But he's saying that in doing that, Freud is actually centralizing sexuality, in our human experience, to the point where he reveals how things like perversity are actually essential to forming societies and power structures. What he's saying is that when we walked away, hearkening back to the days of Sade, when we walked away from, a religious moral point of view, as a society as a whole, in Western thinking, which again spread like disease because of colonialism. When we, walked away from religion, we had to form our society in other terms. And so we chose logic, reason, enlightenment, right? All those old white ways of thinking. But in doing that, those structures had to be formed against something. And so when we walk away from that dichotomy of good and evil in a religious and moral sense, we start to think now in terms of limits and transgressions. That is the brilliant theory that Foucault presents here. That now, in that balance of society, in that society making, in that power structure making, if we no longer hold religion as fundamental, to us, religion now has been replaced with sexuality, because sexuality in our society tends to be the limit, the one sacred limit that it is taboo to transgress against. And we see this, if you don't believe me, look outside, right? Right now we are experiencing a horrific wave of homophobia and transphobia, taking over this nation and others, I'm sure. And I know it's always been that way, but now more than ever, when society is in such a precarious state, right? What are we centralizing, in our human cognition? It goes back to sexuality and denouncing what's sexually perverse so that we can then, uplift what is morally and societally just, right? And who falls, at the expense of that power structure making and society making? We're queer people, the people that are often cast out as, being skewed, as being wrong, as being the way to not be. And this also harkens to the definitions of abjection that Julia Kristeva writes about, and the idea that, by casting out, that otherness as abject, we make ourselves into what we think is, the right thing to be. In the forming of those power structures, again, sexuality is centralized. And this is why he writes, this is why perversity is so integral to society making, because we've centralized it in this new, way of human existence that is the 21st century. Sexuality is at the center of everything. And so it deposits that limit, that society sort of forms as its border, right? And to transgress means to cross that limit and go into the unknown ways, right? The horrifying ways, the sexually perverse ways, as becomes the thing in our society to be reviled. But what Foucault is saying is that because of that, then transgression becomes an essential tool for critiquing society, right? Because transgression and the other world beyond the limit, that it takes us to, that is where everything that's been cast out of society resides, right? But it is from there that we have to draw the criticisms that then formed into things like post-colonial thinking, right? Into critical race theory, into all these critiques of what we are otherwise told to fundamentally believe are just, the foundations of a good and working society, and that's why feminists and queer thinkers are so drawn to thinking in those terms of transgression, right? But Foucault is also saying that there is a perversity then to the other side, right? That to be morally just is not as good as it seems to be, because it requires things like oppression. It requires things like casting out things as other, as abject, and oppressing them, sublimating them, so that the right way of thinking can arise. And that's where things like colonialism stem from, right? That's where things like transphobia, queerphobia of all kinds stem from. Those are integral parts of a morally just society. But then Foucault is saying, well, those also have an edge of perversion to them, right? So is perversion not, a useful tool, in power making? But it depends on who harnesses, that idea of being the one that's, the right one, the one that rises above everything else. That is one way of being perverse. And then what's cast out as other, as being, the perverse world, in this dichotomy that's formed through society making. These are two different kinds of perversity. And that is where I want to say, I do think that Foucault writes from both of them, from both of these perspectives, because on the one hand, Michel Foucault was, the victim of a society that really sort of reviles those who are mentally ill or have disabilities, and he writes about that extensively as well, of course, in some of his other works. But there's also the notion that Foucault seems to know these structures and these power-making strategies well, because there are accusations that he himself was an abuser, that he himself was a predator of children. And of course, these are accusations, but they're accusations that come from people that knew him well. So I take them seriously, right? So it seems that, yes, Foucault writes from the perspective of the oppressed and empowers them, by saying, no, transgression is the main tool through which you can draw phenomenological value from your existence as other, as undesirable. That's all good and fine, but then there's also acknowledging that he himself partook in abuse, and that, abuse is, of course, very well informed by perversity. So then from that uncomfortable reality, right, like that destabilizing of there being two modes of perversion, on how they kind of feed each other in this weird spiral. And that's how Foucault figures it as well, that these are notions that are not opposite to each other, but they spiral, they interconnect, they're opposite, but sometimes they're the same, right? And I think that there's no better writer through which to draw like the true sincerity of how these things percolate than the one and only Peter Sotos. So unlike Foucault, who may have played the role of the victim, but may have actually been the abuser himself, Sotos, like de Sade, has no reservations about the fact that he is the abuser. From the beginning, he's arrested after the publishing of his first written work, in which he decided to publish actual child pornography on the cover of one of the volumes of Pure. Which of course led to his arrest. And from there, we understand, no, Peter Sotos is an abuser. He is a perverted and dangerous person in very literal, societal ways. He is a danger to some people, and he has committed unforgivable crimes, in my eyes at least, because no form of art, in my perspective, justifies propagating abuse of that kind. I don't care how edgy you are. But all the same, the reason I keep reading, studying, and talking about his work is because these are not things that he's ever denied. Peter Sotos has never claimed to be a good person. He said, no, I'm a piece of shit. I'm a fucking abuse. Like, you give me the chance, I will hurt someone. That's the honest and sincere perspective from which he writes. And one would ask, well, what's it worth reading something like that? Well, in his work, Tool, he writes dialogue, much like de Sade. It's just a constant dialogue of a man who is a pedophile, and he is about to sexually abuse a little girl. And the entirety of the first part of this work, Tool, is him telling the little girl all the horrible things that he's going to do to her and how much he's going to enjoy it. And it just goes on and on and on. And, to some, this could be extremely disturbing. Some would just be like, oh, wow, an edgy white man, groundbreaking. But really, one has to consider that if we take all of these postings of transgression, in its philosophical sense, seriously, like I do, there is meaning to be drawn from this. And indeed, one of the most fascinating things about Tool to me is that it acknowledges, that this kind of perversity leads to a fulfillment, and that this kind of, master and slave dialectic is indeed essential to, the building of notions that we have about power, right? Because power is so essential to our society. Power is how we keep control. Whoever has power has control. But Sotos draws that down to its personal level and sort of strips it bare, of all its social complications, and shows it for what it really is, predation. That's what the perversity in his writing is, right? But that predation, that being a predator in that sense, does lead you to feeling fulfillment, again, in your integrity. I know I keep using those words, but really, it's the way in which, it opens with the narrator of Tool saying, I'm going to do all of this to you because it's what makes me, right? I want pleasure because I'm a human that pursues pleasure, and I draw it from this horrible scenario, right? And I like it, and because of that, I feel fulfillment. And fulfillment, is that not what we all hope to achieve, right? This is human perspective, talking about despicable things, but all the same, acknowledging, well, it's the same pursuit for pleasure that everybody is in on. And of course, we don't have to forgive it. We don't have to accept it. In fact, we shouldn't. And Foucault writes, we shouldn't. We should acknowledge the precarious, dangerous notions that can arise from transgression and perversion, but also acknowledge that they can still be engaged in dialogue and logic and reasoning in these ways, and that they do speak to something nascent in our human identity, which is very disquieting, especially when you realize that's what the people in power pursue as well, at the expense of a lot of us, right? But the other fascinating thing that Sotos reveals in Tool is that this dialectic, it's not a dichotomy, because, the master and the subdued, and of course this goes to writings by Hegel that I myself don't really fucking understand, but I've read people that have written about Hegel, and I kind of understand those. But anyway, this idea that for one to be master, for one to be in control, the victim still has to be willing to be a victim, right? And indeed, towards the end of this dialogue in Tool between the predator and the victim, the voice of the predator starts to break down the more he reflects on how dependent on victimizing this person, his pleasure is. The more he dwells on it, he starts to realize, oh my God, actually, I'm in a very precarious situation myself, right? Because I've just dialogued on and on and on about how all of my pleasure, all of my sense of being is dependent on being a predator. Now I realize if I don't have a victim, I'm nothing. And indeed, towards the end of the dialogue in Tool, the predator starts to even sort of beg the little girl and takes on the role of being the subdued in some kind of way and saying, please be the victim, please, because without that, I am nothing. And the sincerity in Sotos's writing doesn't just speak to his need to feel powerful and be perverted and victimize others, but also he's fully sincere about how pathetic that pursuit is. He's fully sincere about how laughable, a predator is when one strips him of, his power and reveals, no, you're not engaged, in this hierarchy that you think you are, but you're, oscillating between, that dialectic of master and servant. And you see yourself as subdued sometimes, even though you don't like to acknowledge it. That is the true patheticness behind your state of being. And that is, I think, the true power that perversity can give to the oppressed. And that is where I come to the last work I want to talk about, which is Lust by Jelinek, who's become one of my favorite authors. Since I read this a couple years ago, it became my favorite read of that year. I think it was 2022. Even though I initially gave this 1 star and hated it, now I absolutely adore the intention and sort of voice behind it. So, like Tool, again, this is just abuse. That's all that the book Lust is. It is a woman being constantly abused by her husband, and just constant descriptions of that abuse, and then abuse from other people, and then it ends, sort of. And that's all it is. And really, that sort of abuse, rape, sexual assault, torture, like all that, it's written over and over, repeatedly, which is why I hated it the first time I read it. But then I realized Jelinek is deconstructing, the idea that a predator is in full control and in full power. Because here she writes from the voice of the victim, but the victim is sort of replicating the voice of the abuser. She writes about abuse, but trying to imagine what the male perspective of that abuse is, and sort of disarms the language of abuse entirely. Recapitulates abuse and sexual assault over and over, but does so through metaphor, through rewording, through revisiting the same scenes, but in different, slightly shifted perspectives. And it's just that over and over, to the point where, even the victim is able to turn her abuse into something passive, transient, and gains a kind of empowerment because she's the one harnessing the language of it, right? And that is where, this kind of like power and perversion is, that when the victim knows perversion through and through, they can shift the table, so to speak, at least, in intellectual and philosophical contexts, such as writing fiction is, right? But, it's also just that fascinating idea that society is built on this precarious, almost arbitrary decision of who's in power and who's not. But when the dispossessed, when the oppressed, when the marginalized are able to take control of that language and that reality and that perspective, they are able to address it through things like transgression, through things like critiquing, acknowledging, questioning limits and logic, and the right way to be, right? Then they're able to shift the power structure in extremely fascinating ways. And that is the essence, I think, of the worth of things like transgressive fiction like this, right? Like we tend to think of it in very repetitious terms, right? Like especially with extreme horror, where we think, oh, it's just the same thing over and over, right? Why are we constantly analyzing this and recapitulating the same abuse over and over? Why read about horror? Why read about disgusting things? And I say, well, it's because these are realities that we also have to consider. And these are realities from which some people are writing. I've written a book and I've been a victim of abuse myself. And so I feel myself like I can take, power from words and language and reasoning and thinking and shift it and reveal things about myself, right? That are empowering, while denouncing that which we think is monolithic in its power and influence. Essentially, considering things like perversity, not just in terms of good and evil, but in terms of, the dialectics that they're engaged with in our society. I think that's where we truly draw untapped knowledge. That's where we truly find, fascination and fulfillment of a kind that social propriety simply can't provide us. And I think that that's beautiful. I think that just being able to assert one's otherness or ugliness or, subduedness as power, I think that has certainly been one of the most fulfilling movements in my own personal and intellectual life. But also just the idea that all of it comes from nasty ass gay shit. I don't know. I just kind of love that for my brand.